Добрый день еще раз, уважаемые гости, уважаемые...
Good afternoon once again, dear guests, distinguished colleagues, dear students. With your permission, we're going to commence the second part of our roundtable, since we're all in attendance. On official agenda, we have two roundtables, but the same faces are seen here. There are not that many of us studying Japanese, politics and economics, and as real experts on Eastern languages, we study everything comprehensively, so I'm very happy to see some new faces who are obviously interested in a cultural exchange, the influence of the language on this cultural exchange, and I'm happy to begin our second part. So we're beginning with a report of our distinguished guest, Professor of MGIMO of Gurevich Tatiana Mikhailovna. International State University. I called my language. A person who commands a language is a moderator of multicultural interaction. We are now talking a lot about multicultural communications and contacts. Supposing that the main point for the person, if he knows the grammar and the language, the words, this is basically quite enough. Many come to study the language and are limited only with that. But I'd like to pay attention to the fact that long ago it has been said, and we all know it's clear, that language doesn't exist outside the culture, outside the social combination of practical skills and ideas which characterize our way of life. So in other words, culture is everything that's necessary to know and understand, to behave acceptably with the members of the said community. And this is what we're trying to educate our students, apart from grammar and what is customary called learning Eastern languages. On the next slide. On the next slide, I will introduce some issues on interaction of language and culture. Of course, it's certain that reflection in lexics and phraseology of the cultural content is a Japanese language world view, picture of the world. I don't think we have to explain it in this audience, what exactly it means. In grammatical forms, specific moments of national culture are reflected. Some time ago it was said that that adverbs are also as much a part of culture as a cathedral of Kazan. And of course, language formulas as cultural settings, and I mean the etiquette, using certain language forms, forms of apologies and gratitude, introductions and fine are necessary for Japanese speech, for Japanese speakers, forms of politeness that are related to the ritual, which is highly important and are typical, obvious examples of interaction between language and culture. And this is exactly why when studying Japanese language and culture of Japan should be in the first place, should take priority. Sometimes it's even more important than knowing grammar or the actual lexics. The culture of the language. Here is the quote on adverbs. And now we're talking about language concepts. The concepts such as the world, truth, lies, freedom, cleverness, personality, kindness, benefit, duty, fate, consciousness, and soul. In the last 10 years, concepts of Russian culture was edited in Stepanov's dictionary, and these words were quoted here, and the frequency of their use were well described in this dictionary by Mr. Stepanov. As to do with Japanese culture, I have placed them here in terms of frequency of use. Japanese language concepts. Japanese linguists and culturologists are also writing about this. This is Giri, Kokoro, Omayasi. And it's interesting that in Russian language we do not give verb concepts. We have mostly noun concepts in Japanese. The Japanese feel that verb forms are also concepts of Japanese culture, and here they're quoted. Of course, it shouldn't be said that idioms and phrasal verbs are also forms of verbalizing this concept. How do we translate our Russian saying "avos"? God willing. Thank God we probably don't have to translate it. Also, the frequency of use of certain expressions is very interesting. Kokoro. Speaking of kokoro and soul, and in Russian and in Japanese discourse, it is quite often used, whereas in English-speaking discourse, the words that are translated, these words are much more rarely used, and this is reflected in numbers, in statistics. Speaking of the culture of the language, it is my favorite idea. Look at the common lines running between the languages. Kokoro, the famous novel, is translated into Russian as the heart, and into other languages they left the word kokoro. They did not translate it to their own language, and here is the different content between the two languages. And of course it says it in all the dictionaries, but I really enjoy the idea that translation begins when dictionary ends. That's when translation begins. And it wasn't to no effect that this advertising in Japan for our School of English So please take a look. It's not important how it is said, but why. So the communicative intent, and to understand and choose the right means of communications. Of course, we have to understand the etiquette, consider the social status and age, corresponding ages of the communicating parties. And this is why I really love this piece of advertising, Tavaroko. And this is what we're studying. This is what we have to teach. And moving on, I think that there are many experts on Japan here who understand what Taichi Sakaya wrote in his book about Japan, what Japan represents, Hakeri Yogana Sinaikoto. The culture is what is not expressed clearly in words. And of course, I'd like to remember the Russian poet Tuchev, but I won't because it's too routine in our daily communication. So the culture is what could be, not always could be formulated with speech. And this is also one of the specifications of Japanese culture. Sakaya and Isibata also talked about it. Japanese language. So it shouldn't be done. And we often come across a situation when reading the newspapers and surfing the internet, the students can close their eyes and translate it, but when they take a real Japanese text, where all the words are clear and the grammar is correct, that's where they come up against, they encounter difficulties. Why do we encounter this in the Japanese culture? It's more important to follow the external norms of communication, and this is the idea of Japanese linguists. So the dialogue is not a way of self-expression, but a way of gratifying your counterparty, the person whom you're speaking to, so making them grateful, gratifying them. This is a misprint. And to understand the science of non-direct communication, we have to understand the contents behind the words. So, understanding the context, His Majesty, the context. Otherwise, we never turn to it in Japanese. If you don't know the context, you won't be able to translate anything. And a famous ritual stereotype of speech, a very typical saying by the Japanese linguist Haga. The eloquence is not to call the things by their names. This is how the message is born and is more interesting. Now, all of this, all of the above said, describes Japanese communication and Japanese language. Moving on. Let's remember the saying from Jacques Inager, when we come up against Europeans face to face. Even the loudness of their voice suppresses you physically, intimidates you physically, and I'm a member of the older generation, and of course I'm physically sometimes struck by how loudly, even in Russian, some sayings sound. And that's why I really understand Japanese people well in this context. Now, which phonetic parameters of the linguistic means of communication should we focus our attention on? Quite often we skip this. Phonetics are quite simple. In our institute, at least, we do not specifically tackle phonetics, but the intensity, the timbre, the rate of speech, the tone, the pauses, the melody bears a huge role to be well perceived. Not even understood, but perceived by Japanese counterparts. And this is why Japanese pop divas that we often see on TV with these rough male voices, this is not typical for Japan, for Japanese speech, for Japanese discourse. This is completely different. And of course there are various signals of trying to express the information and pass it on. In the first year of university, we understand the non-verbal. We study non-verbal elements, gestures, asking people to approach, for example, with your hand. To be quiet, so different non-verbal forms of communication, pointing to their own nose, and modal verbs and the mimics express the attitude of the speaker and his assessment to the objects and events. Of course, they say that Japanese are not Italians, they're not that expressive, but actually 65% of the information is passed non-verbally and only 35% passed verbally. And this is also has been proven. So all of this should be considered, and we should be aware of that. Within this context, please excuse me, I'm also living in a modern world. Please allow me to advertise my own textbook, The Strategy and Tactics of Japanese Business, Communication. And this is what I called it. It says a lot about it, not just about that, but also about how Japanese perceive it. But this is the material that comes from Japanese sources and is written by Japanese for Japan. It is very difficult to read, quite complex, but a lot of new and interesting ideas. When I was working on this textbook, I was so surprised. I found out so much new. I was assisted by Japanese colleagues from the University of Shizuoka, and this is what should be aware of. But if we don't know about it, then there are sometimes confusing moments. And I'm referring to translations now. I'm sorry, let me show you the slide. If this is not true, this is a funny picture. Then it turns out there is misunderstandings. The picture is quite amusing. You can find it, a lot of this type of pictures online. Sometimes there are foreigners at quite high social levels communicating with Japanese, and it looks comical from the sidelines as to how. And it's clear that it's very difficult to reach common ground and achieve understanding in these conditions. And this is why, once again, I'm coming back to the text regarding translations, what we always do, what we teach you to do, to translate. And like I said, translation begins when dictionary ends. And this is simply recoding the words of one culture into letters or into signs of another, into symbols of another culture. And I like Supiro's idea that culture is what a nation does and thinks, but the language is how it does that. And one point is the possessive sense. Just imagine how much is said about possessive sense when there is always someone spelled with a capital I. And we understand well. And of course, speaking of translation, and this is why I constantly say to our students, when I say it's difficult for you to read Murakami in Japanese, but please do not use the English translation, because this is a completely different piece of literature altogether. Look how many words we have with Japanese translation. And this is why the challenge of the translator is signifying the limitations of this language space within Japanese culture. So within this context, we have to find corresponding meanings to Russian. And let me tell you about a textbook. Textbook, in my viewpoint, shouldn't teach in foreign language as such, speaking of English language textbooks, for instance, but to create different foreign way of thinking. But this can be intercultural communication or adaptation. This can be getting some information about culture and society of Japan, or studying language as a scientific discipline. This is what lecturers, linguistic university lecturers are doing at ISA. And in conclusion, I would like to show what we quite often come up against. Look at what it says at the airport. It says, in Japanese language, once again, speaking in Japanese, it says, "We hope to see you again," in English. This is from the Japanese internet segment. And then the Japanese wrote it in Chinese. But it's also a well-wish in Korean. And what it says in the airport, in our airport, you remember? Please take a look at it next time you're at the airport. I won't remind you. That's all for me. on the agenda. Thank you, Tatiana Pavlova, for your interesting report. Let's continue working in the same format. 1 or 2 questions follow after each session, and after the second presentation, we'll come back to the roundtable talk. If you have any specific questions for Tatiana Mikhailovna, please, now is the time to ask. Okay. Thank you very much, Korovina Yulia. I'm the teacher of the School of the East at Nyusha, and you talked about paralinguistical means, intensiveness of speech, the rate of speech, but when you said Japan, Japanese, you talked about a single mass of Japanese. Do you think that, since I teach students, young people, I have a feeling that you have to consider age factors, that because modern Japanese youth, same as our young people, people of a different order altogether, and how much and when does it become critical to separate the object of research, I mean the Japanese as at large, or maybe specific age groups, regional groups? Thank you very much for your question. I don't think we're able to do this easily. For our institute, we clearly defined that we are preparing people to become official interpreters. The experience shows that students, after visiting Japan for 2 weeks and coming back, they can speak Japanese fluently. Same as a street language. Of course, it's very different street language to the language behind the negotiating table, but please think about different dialects. And now Japan is rebirthing this Hogan, and this is why it should be considered. And how difficult may it be to understand the elder generation, and that's why this challenge. And we're saying all of this exists, mind you, but we are taking this median form of the TV hosts, and we're preparing our guys not to adapt into Japanese culture, but to provide the necessities, the needs, our needs in communicating with the Japanese people. This is why all of the melody and the rate of speech and the intonation, it's important for them to look good, to be perceived well speaking. But everything else, well, the more they get, the better. Which prefecture are they in? And also, understanding is important. But of course, they love watching anime, and we also have one anime in our curriculum, which is called Gone with the Ghosts. And all of our technologies allow us to watch everything. And there are students that are communicating with Japanese students. We also have them at our university quite fluently, actually. However, they have to be reminded of a certain framework of classwork, because this is you're in class now. You shouldn't do this. You can talk like this in a stadium or on a street. Not Sakaya. I'm not saying Sakaya, but you have to sort of remind them of different settings appropriate to the circumstance. Anastasia Nyushi, 4th year. I have a question regarding phonetics, but within the framework of a literary translation. When I was trying to read Russian and Japanese texts in parallel, Japanese word order is so different from Russian that it unequivocally affects translations, speaking about literature and also not even mentioning poetry. And is it possible to adequately represent or translate the Japanese texts? If our old, like Drevny sensei, taught us that good, adequate translation is when person reading in Russian can perceive the text the same as a Japanese reading it in Japanese, then this is a great skill. This is an art. And this is unattainable achievement in some ways, because we're focusing on in different ways, on different priorities, because the Japanese, even without mentioning phonetics, are focusing on politeness, wadza, for example. And when you are translating that, and we're used to it now, but I remember when people used to say, why am I engaged? I'm not engaged. That's why I came here to negotiations. So lots of cultural misunderstandings used to happen. And this is difficult. How do we translate that? And phonetics, the different funny sounds, this is common for any language. But here we have a problem. We are not preparing translators of literature. We are trying to make sure that the speech is correct, grammatically correct, literally correct, that there are good rhythm, good intonation, and of course articulation, gestures, and phonetics. Thank you. Any more questions? Now, using the right of the moderator, please allow me to ask the question that Anastasia asked. Let me ask it from our Japanese guests. Now, the lady is speaking Japanese. Translation is suspended.
原則的にはできるかすごく差が引いていますから難しい問題ですね難しい課題ですねその移すのが原則的には安倍先生の下前先生金さんできますかどう思いますかТо есть я перевела вопрос Анастасии.
I translated the question of Anastasia. Is it possible, in principle, to do such a translation?
Что это значит? Translator это иногда
Translator sometimes gives a reverse meaning to the words. Direct speech in Russia prevails. Who is at fault? Who to blame? What to do? It's not so simple in Japan. In Kyoto, specifically, what does it mean? Speaking Japanese. It means go. Keep walking. That's why there are many fine details. And a lot depends on context, of course, like Irene has correctly mentioned. Speaking of science and society, this isn't as direct as maths and physics. But I cannot read Shakespeare. This is impossible in Japanese. You cannot read it in a way that it isn't understandable. It's difficult. Or what exactly do you mean? It's too difficult? It's not clear? Or it's not what you expect from Tolstoy?
有名な翻訳家の米原麻里さんという有名な翻訳家がいて、彼女は美しい悪女かそれ仕込めっていうと難しい。
Japanese spoken.
を考えながら訳すという。
Japanese.
はい、どうもありがとうございました。いや、
Somebody who did not understand it. It's very briefly. It's one of the interpreters from the Japanese into Russian. That the interpreter had a very difficult task because you needed to find a balance between the oskusi and yaku and chudistiki, and the correctness between the beauty and so so you need just to translate close to the original is not always good, because the aesthetic canons and the linguistic canons into Japanese are different, so we need just to underline other things not in the original. So there is the question, where was the original? Where was Tolstoy and Gogol translated into Japanese? So the things are very difficult to follow and to read it grammatically correct. And one word, the translation of Dostoevsky, Komoyama, had a lot of dialogues and disputes. Dostoevsky, so the word sladostrastie, so in the previous translations it was, I don't remember it in Japanese, there was a Japanese word, kataism, so meaning sladostrastie. Katoyama means sex. Katoyama translated as sex. So this is just how you translate it. Lasciviousness. So Japanese people, so they accepted that it's different. So thank you. I will give you another example, and I will tell you about Eko Kamayama, who supposed to be here. That was our idea. So I will give you some comments, and I will give you another example. So in translation, Ikoyama, the word emancipation. How was it changed comparing with the previous translations? In the previous three translations, the three famous translations of the Karamazov brothers Karamarovs, Josei Kaiho, the freedom of the woman, and they were given a comment what was meant by this. Komoyama Sensei, the translation of Jiyu Saikatsu, Japanese. It does not mean the freedom, and whether you have this to be freed of. So the woman, speaking Japanese.
Действительно, вот в новых.
So the new Kamayama just represent the new translation family. So as Tatiana Mikhailovna said, he was criticized because he makes the translation very easily, very simple. So the freedom of life, this is the politic sense. You have to understand it as a politic sense. So in this program, just you can see the first theme was as a key of understanding. It was the topic of our session. The rector had just to be here, but he was not able just to come here. But actually, we expected him here with these comments. But Dostoevsky just came out here in our program, and if we deal with translation, Dostoevsky comes here automatically. So Dostoevsky is a key for understanding of translations. If you don't have any comments, we will go step forwards to my report. So it has to do with it continues to develop is what Tatiana Mikhailovna has said here. And now the name of my report will be later. Is there some intrigue? The name will be later, but I will start with simple things to develop our topic about the Japanese languages. Has a lot of closed words, a lot of hide words. I will give you. I will try just to explain what can you find behind the words. So it characterizes the Japanese language, and we have just to see this. We have just to identify it, to clarify it. We have just to, without understanding of the background of what is behind the words, the communication is not possible. So the communication is not possible. So different levels of understanding. So I will start with the simple Aisatsu. So where we start the Japanese language, start learning Japanese language. So we learn different cliches. So the opening is the 15 greetings. But there is nothing said about what is behind these words. And we did not look intensively inside it. Because I tried just to explain it just one more time, and it was difficult to understand. It's rather difficult just to feel. Now, the social cultural values, because we need the language background. So actually you can try it at once. Maybe you can try it at once. Maybe you can explain it at once. It's sumimasen. What is mimasen? It's formed by the verb sumu, and it tries to end. Sumimasen is not ended. Sumimasen. These things are very familiar. Did you not completed what? Not completed what? Not completed what? Just what? Do you have any variants? Do you have any? Truly speaking, we had a text. Sorry, this was our text on exams. The sumo was formed by another verb. It was about the cleanness. I will not tell this text, but it was not from the etymology completed, but the logic was very interesting. So I would like this to hear this version. I will give you a comment. You know, the Japanese person who write about the Japanese culture. To explain this, what is the politeness, the благодеяние, we need to return this. We know about the Japanese culture. We know what means angaesi, and if there's something was done good for you, you need this to be grateful to this. You need this to pay back. If something good is done to Japanese people, they feel some discomfort. That's what I found from Japanese sources. It's not completed. It's not completed. Never. It will never end. On Gaisi, I will be grateful to him. I will be grateful to him, and it won't end. It will never end. But meanwhile, chrysanthemum and match in English, English language translated thank you, and Japanese understand it as I'm ashamed to be in this position. I'm feeling some discomfort. Somebody just picked up the hat who was raised by the wind. The Japanese, I've never met this person before. I've never seen this person before. So I'm ashamed in front of this person. I will offer my excuse. Sumimasen, I accept this, and the affair just will not end by accepting this hat. What can I do? But we do not know each other, and I do not know how I can return it to him. Sumimasen. Behind one word, you can find the whole range of Japanese culture. Maybe just the people commanding Japanese language will explain this. So the report, how can you find yourself in the translation? You need to translate this to be understandable, and I will do it on the basis of some examples. I have thousands of these examples, but I will give you a couple of examples. Where shall we start? Theoretically, one slide about this theoretical. Just when you are dealing with foreign language, you some sort of protest we have inside our languages. It has to do with different.
And in conjunction, this gives us a conclusion that Japanese expert Tanyata Kihiro makes. Speaking Japanese. So it means, literally, this is a direct translation, Tatiana Mikhailovna, of what you said, that grammar means culture equals culture. So if we cut it down to two words, grammar means culture at the end of the day. But if we look at it on a deeper level, grammar means culture. This is a debatable premise. So we'll ask to say whether this is true or not, because not everyone agree with this statement. I would like to take one grammar category. I'm not going to tell you in terms of grammar what is transferability, but the understanding behind it. Because Tatiana Mikhailovna has mentioned Japanese culture a lot, and passive sense. Passive voice is also the Japanese view of the world. It's also a quote from Japanese culturologists. But transferability as a category of understanding, we understand that transferable verb is kudosi, and zi. What is zi? For people who just began studying Japanese, what does it mean? It means touching the nose in Japanese. It means me, myself, the action when it occurs on its own. So accordingly, when we keep thinking about this premise, it turns out that the result is beyond our control, and this is very important to understand. Speaking in Japanese, and these verbs, also as passive voice, are the face of Japanese language and culture, since their usage is described in the sources as the peculiarity of Japanese way of thinking. And why do I show Mount Fuji? Many of those of you who visited Japan for a day, week, 2 months, or a year had come across the fact that sometimes in the morning it turns out that Fuji can be seen. And if we look at this picture, I'll ask you, what can you see there? And before you reply what you see in the picture, I would ask you to pay attention to the way the question is structured. For us, it's a natural question. What do you see in this picture? It is an unnatural question for Japanese, because Japanese will translate this with the verb miero. And all of you heard the situation when the Japanese are running past you in a corridor and saying miero, miero. Maybe last year when we came with a school delegation to Japan, lived in Hatsuoji, and in the morning we came to a canteen and everyone running around and saying miero. What does it mean? Fuji-san miero. No one is talking about themselves. I see Fuji. We talk about it. We are aliens in this life. It doesn't matter what we hear and what we see. It is visible on its own. We cannot affect that. But in the language, we say that we see it. We put ourselves first. What do you see? I see Fuji. Whereas in Japanese, it will sound like passive voice, miero kokoeru. And these fine details that we don't even pay attention to are actually display vividly the peculiarity of Japanese view of the world and Japanese way of thinking. And another classic case in point is I would like to show you. I showed it at the conference. Did I show some of the students? This is an expression which can be seen in Japanese textbooks. It's grammatically correct, and this expression says made tea. We understand how to translate it, to make tea, and we don't see anything that could confuse us. However, when I ask the Japanese whether they say that, ochao erero, when the lady host giving a cup of tea to the visitors, saying this, the Japanese said, yes, of course we say that. And this was a situation when we had some interns, some students, and I asked them this question, and they said, yes, it is used. And then I showed them the second variant. Tea came. Of course, it's better to say that, they say. Tea came, tea has brewed. Of course, tea has come is a rough approximation, but the difference here is between I made tea or the tea has arrived. So the main point is the tea has arrived. The visitors have tea. And who made the tea? This is a secondary issue. So using this passive voice in verbs is primary. And when we begin discussing it, and I asked the students, why do you say that first is correct? They started talking, they started debating. It was a difficult question. They began arguing. Why do we say that? Because I said, you do use it, don't you? You said you use it. And in our discussion, we came to gender roles in modern Japanese society, that a modern woman doesn't want to eliminate herself from the sentence as a subject. It doesn't want to be removed. It wants to define her role. She is the subject. She made that cup of tea. She is the subject. I made that tea, and I brought it here. So this discussion took us about 1.5 hours before arriving at that idea, and I'm jumping to the conclusion, just to display, just to underline how important it is to understand these fine differences, because a lot lies behind it. And I would also like to make another important point about other group of verbs, like to wash, or the picture is hanging on the wall. Reflexible verbs. We're talking about reflexible verbs now, and if we look at the depth of the world, the picture is hanging on the world, or I'm washing myself. Zibun or rao, to wash, or ayawadzu zibu, saseru. This sounds very strange if we look at the motivation behind the word, and it turns out that using this reflexive verbs, we understand that action is done. It doesn't just happen on its own. It's difficult in Russian because to smile or to be smiled. So let me stop at this case in point to bring to your attention, for you to note the usage of various verbs. It's a subject for full-scale research, not even for one person, but a whole group of researchers. Like Irene mentioned, we have to look at various time periods and the history and the background. And let me please quote two cases of from translations of Chekhov's Seagull, Chaika, and talking about transitional verbs. And Nina said, I'm not recognizing here. And in Japanese, it turns into different approaches with three. All three translators it sounds the same with all three interpreters. First of all, Nina says, I do not recognize you. Speaking Japanese. In all three cases, the Japanese are using non-transitional verbs. You have changed. You became a different person. And then Nina says the same. It's you who changed. Ninaru, kavaru, and once again Ninaru. So it's not an active, to recognize, it's not an active verb. It's a mind, it's an effort of the mind. It's our mental effort to recognize somebody. In Japanese, it's not reflected in language. It just happens on its own. You became different and I'm different, so we exchange pleasantries. It's not you're not the same, and you're not the same either. So the personal effort disappears in translation. The person as a subject loses its precedence. We simply say, you're different, and the reply is, yes, and you're different too. Another example is, your life touches me. And of course, Chekhov is highly metaphorical, and this is a work of literature. But to understand this case, we see that your love touches me, and if we translate it literally, it becomes Savaro, Foreiro, Zibuno, Savaro, Jibuno, Foreiro. This sounds very strange in Japanese, but we don't have the feeling of vacancy when we read a Russian text. This is a beautiful sentence from Chekhov that touches us to tears. Your love touches me, but in Japanese translation, no one touches no one. In Japanese translation says, arigatai, very grateful, thank you. Your attitude is very pleasant to me. I'm very happy with your pleasant attitude towards me. And also I'd like to focus your attention at the difference in the times, in the decades. First was 1960s, and the latest was 2014, Nomano Mutsuyoshi. Different epochs, different era, different people, different approach. Mutsuyoshi doesn't belong to the new school, but his translation is somewhat simplified, not in a negative sense of the word. He is more modern, so he splits long sentences into three parts to make it clearer. Because we sometimes get confused in Dostoevsky's sentences. And what will Japanese, just imagine the difficulties Japanese come to with reading Dostoevsky. But here we see singularity. So this is an important point. Love doesn't touch us. It's our state, not action, but state. And it's very important to understand the essence of Japanese thinking. No one does anything to anyone. We don't look at Fuji. It's on its own. You're not touching me. That's the way I am. There's no responsibility, no control over the events. And we could make endless conclusions, philosophical or worldview-wise. Speaking of Hamlet, and of course metaphoric, it's highly metaphorical, but it could be quite interesting to examine this. Hamlet says, heaven secure, or heavens direct. The heavens preserve and direct Hamlet, But in Japanese translation, we have only one translation. Maybe this is wrong data, but let me tell you, let me show you what I've got. Heaven secure him, heavens keep him safe. In Japanese, we see possessive voice. So, not heaven secure him, but he is under protection of heaven. Heaven preserves him. And we know that Pasternak and Lazinski are two completely different approaches. Lazinski translated his texts close to the original, and Pasternak created the text anew, and he has lots of discrepancies because it's a new work of literature, actually. But here they preserve the original Shakespeare structure, and the Japanese don't do that. Here, heavens will direct it. Will direct. Japanese translation is "let them be." God will not leave Denmark. Heaven rules all. So I won't tell you about all of the examples, but some words freeze thy young blood, the fortune that sends me. We see that in Japanese translation it turns into a completely different sentence altogether. The words are not freezing anyone, fortune is not directing anyone. All of the verbs become non-transferable, the blood freezes on its own, the soul is shaking on its own, no one is shaking it, and through passive you're also directed by fate, not you. So this is how actions are transferred. The beauty is transferred, the behavior kills me, says the mother. Same in Japanese. I won't dwell on this, it's all in my paper. You can read it in more details. And this is the conclusion. This is the very ecstasy of love that makes us. And we see that in this work of literature, we are not going to pay attention, focus on what is accounted here, but look at the numbers. 81% of the text, the grammar of it, was changed, adapted for Japanese thinking, and only 19% of the original was preserved in Japanese translation. So we're talking about inanimate agents now. We're not saying the translator was bad, but we're observing how the ideas, how the thoughts of the translators are changing. But if we find enough cases in point, then and draw upon this experience, we can make certain conclusions on the trends. This aim of the Japanese to avoid control, to avoid responsibility, to lower the rationality of the actions. These conclusions, these tendencies of the Japanese way of thinking are more clearly taking shape and becoming more or less understandable. And let me tell you what I call upon you to do. I'm now wrapping up, since we need time for the Q&A session. I'm calling on you to understand that there are different types of example, representative or non-representative. There should be a full research institute taken modern and study the modern language, the historical language, to make some scientific conclusion. But the ability to see the culture and the way of thinking behind the words is highly important, because without understanding this, our communication with the Japanese won't be fully effective. And when I catch myself thinking that I'd like to say not akeru but okaru, then you begin to approach this idea after 25 years of work with Japan that it's better to say okaru. You are beginning to approach the understanding of how Japanese see this way of the world. And of course, modern Japan is changing. You see the case with tea. Women don't want to choose transitional verbs. They want to choose intransitive verbs to underline their role, highlight their role. And out of this mosaic, we can build the Japanese picture of the world, the Japanese worldview. And I hope I interested you with this approach to studying culture and language. And I hope that you, during your study, will look and keep up on this vector of research. And more questions and comments. Tatiana Mikhailovna had similar examples, including non-verbal communication. Can you tell me what you thought of this discussion? Hello. Thank you very much, Elena Petrovna, for your interesting presentation. And when I was thinking about it, I came up with a different example, different case in point. We were told, and some lecturer told us a story using wrong transitive or intransitive verbs. It really spoiled the attitude, the perception. A student went to homestay with a Japanese family, and in a room where she was living, a heater broke down. And she says to the lady, to the host, the heater is broken. And after this, something went wrong. The attitude, the relationships became slightly strained, and she was explained that she should have said it differently. She should have taken the responsibility on oneself, on herself, saying, I broke the heater. So, you're saying they try to remove responsibility, but in this type of situations it's different. Someone is to blame. Although, obviously, the girl wasn't at fault, at any fault. In a textbook during multicultural communication, I saw a similar case when a daughter comes and says something is broken, and he says, not something is broken, but you broke it, I broke it. So there is sometimes a need to accept responsibility on oneself.
Про ответственность и контроль. Вот, Ульяна Петровна, вы сказали, что...
And you, speaking of responsibility, Ульяна Petrovna, you said that using Didosi, Japanese are constantly removing themselves from the situation.
И вы сказали, что таким образом они избавляются от ответственности и контроля. Не знаю, мне кажется, все-таки здесь не совсем, ну, мое такое представление. То есть мы, конечно,
So this is my understanding.
мышление понимаем, что когда я и мое, то, соответственно, это зона моего.
When I understand this is my and mine, I understand this is my zone of responsibility, and I accept it. It's logical to understand that I'm not accountable here, but it seems to me that something is more complex here. And if we remove ourselves from the picture and look at the Japanese way of life, look at their household, talking about their lifestyle, talking about education and healthcare, this is all quite complex, but there is no feeling that Japanese are absolved of any responsibility, the world existing of itself, and they just came here, ended up here for some reason. The world will end and they'll go to another place. No, there is none of that. I haven't thought of that actually. I think it's a very interesting idea. Also a highly metaphysical relationship. It's as if we aren't really here, although we all know about Japanese garden. There is no human action in there. This is a piece of nature recreated in a small space, but we know that every millimeter, that behind every millimeter of this garden there is a human hand. And we know that, I would say, the Japanese pretend that they're not there. And this is quite interesting as well, an interesting responsibility of culture, and it's quite difficult to understand when studying the language and I never knew about Tombo. I would also say it's broken, and it would have been a huge mistake. And this is why it's asymmetrical situations. And I would like to say how important it is to make the students understand this initially, and it's one of the most complex issues because once again we can talk non-stop about examples, but when you end up in a given situation, in a given setting, and speaking at speed, or you're intern at a company, you may lose your way. It's not even experience, it's shifting your mindset. And this is why the next stage we have to understand that Japanese, a lot of people study Japanese, but not many people learn it, because ultimately you come across the fact that you have to create alternative connections in your head and basically grow a Japanese brain. And in this way, it turns out that there are many challenges here for teaching Japanese, because we do teach Japanese language, and there are lots of challenges here. And of course, the first stage is definitely to communicate this to students, show them in cases how it works, and then how much desire and how much willpower they have and compatibility with Japanese culture. It depends on them to achieve certain heights, because if it doesn't happen, but they need something to switch to, but to use your brain to switch to something, you need to grow this brain initially. Thank you very much. It was a very interesting comment. You spoke of stages of creating secondary language personality. This is a different personality. There is an understanding, or in the method, there is a concept called creating a secondary personality, but this personality in Japanese language is a modern concept which is dissolved. And I'm not sure if there is a term about language personality in Japanese. Chukande is the term. This is an intermediate language. Speaking about second language in English. And of course, in Japanese, it isn't a clear concept, and we have to formulate a different personality, but personality as such, applicable to Japanese culture, is difficult. There's no kago, but only vago. There's kando, and now globalization, and so on and so forth. And with women too, I am sure that this lady is serving tea, and having said that, she never thought that she put herself in the center, but it just happens this way. And I really like what the lady said. When you're looking for something and you say, arimashita, you're looking at it, you're looking for it, but it was always there. So you do have to change your mindset. And also, I'd like to be more careful about imaka, because simagoni and usoto is also possible there. It's also from a Japanese textbooks about iwakan, but surprising where it is about Japanese territories. We are missing this word. We don't have this word. Do we have an understanding about it? This is just how it is. So this is a psychology overall. This is a philosophy. We are using our own words. This is a philosophy in our understanding, and for Japanese, it is just, perception. That's the way they see, they view the world. And in Russian, perception of the world, there's a lot of common points. We're Asians, we're ancient Slavs, and lots of time in lectures they say that European cultures are on the one pole in terms of involving the subject. They say it rates, or il faut, il pleure in French, or there is it. In Japanese there is samui. Who is samui? What is samui? Doesn't matter. The sort of samui, maybe I'm called, or it's called there. So where is Russian language? It's somewhere in the middle. Our language is somewhere in the middle. Geographically, we're in the middle. We're in the middle everywhere. Even statistically, thinking of the cases of usage, it will be funny. English will have 100 cases of use, Japanese 5, and English 40. Even in numbers, this is surprising. This is amazing. This is unbelievable. Dear colleagues, will you have any more comments or questions? I have a question. Coming back to the lack of subject and passive voice, can it be interpreted not in the sense of absolving responsibility, but because in Japanese culture there is a muga concept, which is called absolving yourself from the world and taking an objective part, understanding your role in a world differently. Yes, of course, passive is... yes, of course, I simplified it. In a passive voice, I didn't even begin talking about passive voice. There was itihatsu, imayako, there was lots of everything. We haven't even begun speaking of maivako, that my foot was stepped on, so I have to be pitied, not them. So this understanding of muga, thank you very much for that. It comes from Buddhist truth, from the very source of creation of Japanese state and identity and philosophy. These are muga, muzuoku, these are Buddhist principles. There is no me, everything is shifting. There is no stability and we're going to suffer. Well, let's hope suffering won't happen. But I think this principle of mu as a Buddhist principle, the denial, not even denial, but actually an absence, the emptiness, you have to look for it. And once again, we translate all of this into European. So read more Japanese texts and it will become easier. Unequivocally, those are all great comments. Thank you. So, the absence of that in principle, not absolving ourselves of responsibility, otherwise it wouldn't have been nice towards Japanese or ourselves. Not always use the pacing. The passive voice will absolve you of responsibility. There are different cases. Yes, it's a different understanding of responsibility. And these words, they don't allow us to express our ideas in a necessary way. Dear colleagues, I would like to ask our native speakers to comment in the time remaining.
Hi. In Russian and in Japanese, the difference between Japanese culture and Russian and the European culture is Bog, is the God. This is the only shaping creature of the world. And in our culture, it's animism. So everything just has its own God. That's why nobody is blamed in our country. That's in the Russian culture is one God, and from this point of view, it's not so long. So this is almost all the same. This is the animism, their example of animism. Thank you very much. This is very interesting indeed in understanding, very surprised, very specific examples. Yeah. I would like to represent another version. I think this is excuse, endless excuse, so excuse that never ends. What do you think about that? So we will excuse ourselves, so the excuse that will never end. Yes, actually we offer our excuse for what someone just has done for us. Okay, Japanese language. Sumimasen. Tada sumimasen to. These are examples. I remembered one example of our. I'm your. I will be. This is all the same. I will offer my excuse you forever. So I will offer you my excuse forever. This is one of these examples. That's all. So everybody understands it. Is there something else? So the translation. So I did not recognize you. So I stopped recognizing you. Can you translate it? How can I translate it? So, 会ってなかった。あ、でも。気づくことは。Can I represent magistrant of the first course, of the first linguistic course? This is our university, so the student of the first course. Sure, I will give you this name. Yes. I am returned from Tsukuba just after 10 years stay there. So these questions of intercultural communications are very interesting to me. So I'm engaged in these issues. I am now just in another culture. I'm coming from another culture, and now I'm here. I would like to thank you for this session. I'll try. I want us to discuss the intercultural communications. So this issue changes ourselves. So we cannot tell that the language picture. So the Japanese and Russian culture are static by itself. So they're changing, they're shifting. So it depends on the region. They're changing in time, and also they are changing in the process of communications. So each of these cultures, and that's why we cannot tell here about the process of intercultural communication. So there is one whole culture, someone is representing this culture, and so the Japanese culture, so the person will always changed in this culture. It's not only to touch the language or just to learn the grammar, but to prepare the person for intercultural communication. How shall he use this communication? How shall he behave himself in one or another environment? Should he behave himself in one particular environment? And so that the behavior is not identical. So because the Japanese behavior is different, and someone who is speaking Japanese will accept it differently. So actually, so a person who is for a long period of time contacting, because we are communicating with different parties, so we are always changing. We always learn something from another culture, from another language, because it's always changing. How can you deal with these things? Do you know, do you have any thoughts about this? Actually, this is a very complicated topic. So the most important thing that we have to do here is to learn how they can accept the signals. It's you cannot behave yourself. So we are bakagaijin anyway. So we will tell it as it is. So this is how it is. But learning this, it happens automatically. It happens when the person is open to communicate. We are behaving like small kids. So the small kids accept it automatically. So this is why. So actually, when we banned, so when Japanese banned, when they were sitting behind at the back of their mothers, he knew from the very beginning that he has to bend himself this is the expressiveness of gratings. There are different levels of this. You cannot learn someone just to imitate, because people who do not accept it, it can be very ridiculous, like monkeys. So the most important thing is to learn what it is, the meaning of things. It depends on which environment he is going to work. If he is going to work with teachers from the one or another university, if he is going to work with business people, it will be another communicating environment. And if he is able to accept the signals, everything will be all right. But it has to be taught. It's very important that another side has to accept it as well. So this is the mutual process. I am not agreed with this. What does it mean? Another side, your appearance, you always be as you are, and you will be accepted. So Japanese people they read it out. This is some sort of stereotype. You are yourself. And afterwards, when you will start communicating in this process, so it will be communicating on a good level. So Japanese people will accept you as you are, and they will see you as a normal person. This is a very I can behave myself. I can behave myself like Japanese. This is my identity. It has to do with my identity. And from this point of view, I would like that both sides have to understand that we are different and that there are no Japanese forms of attitudes, Russian forms of attitudes. Because some separate representatives of cultures, they can have a complex of different cultures, right? But the complex, this is the wish to understand the person you are communicating with. If this is a mutual process, it will be a problem. But if it does not exist, and you will be outside of this process. That's what I wanted. There's some sort of point so the movement has to be come from one side. It has to be mutual. We have to understand then that it's always the mutual process. It's a bilateral process, and it's always wishable just to cross ourselves someone in the middle. It has to be mutual. This is the mutual process. Yeah. Please. I would like to add some comments. This movement, what you mentioned right now, has to be in the frame of each individual person. Teaching the Japanese, we are interested in Japanese culture. Our Russian culture, we do not pay attention to our Russian culture. It doesn't make any sense for us. But coming in another environment, we are starting to accept it. We are starting to understand the culture when you are in another environment. From the point of linguistics, we are starting to learn ourselves. We are positioning ourselves in this environment. We are also looking at ourselves by means of another eyes, by means of another persons, by eyes of another persons. Dear colleagues, our time is up. I would like to thank everybody for your questions, for your interest, for coming here, and we will hope that what we have created here today will have a bilateral and a mutual effective communication. Thank you very much for being here. We will end it here. Thank you very much.